panel the IBTTA, or was it the rep forum? Was it IBTTA who were on the same panel?
So excellent. We'll go ahead and get started and try our best to keep on time. My name is Mark Finlayson. I'm chairman of the board of NC Go, the proud co-host with NCDOT of the summit, and we're delighted to see you. This is a great crowd, and very pleased that you found some interest in this topic. Andy Wells, who's a member of the Board of Transportation, was supposed to be here with introductory remarks, but something came up. Andy couldn't join us, but let me take this opportunity to thank the board members because what they do, their public service is of great value to the state, and they set policy, they set direction for the department, and they're indispensable to a successful system. And so we thank Andy, we thank all our board members. I think I saw Tony Lathrop come in. He's one of those that we appreciate. So as moderator of the session, I'm proud to tee this subject up because I think it's very important, and I think it's going to be more important as we start moving into the future of transportation revenue innovation. Because we all know that the gas tax is unsustainable. It's not the long-term revenue solution. Fuel-efficient internal combustion cars are driving that change. Also EVs, obviously. And this is all going to require a new investment strategy for transportation. So today we're going to hear about national and state mileage-based user fee pilots, in particular the Argo pilot, which you'll hear about in a second. And we know these are important, but the topic has and likely will continue to raise implementation concerns. So what we're going to try to do in this session is to focus on how to effectively communicate a mileage-based user fee program to the public or to policymakers, and try to address some ways to meet the challenges that are associated with common myths and concerns that the public might have about this. Our state has conducted a mileage-based user fee pilot. There'll be a national pilot this year. We're going to hear about those things and others, but we're fortunate in that regard to have an excellent panel of knowledgeable people for you today. Jen Rash is a communication consultant with PRR. She has extensive communication experience in mileage-based user fee programs and other emerging transportation topics. Since 2015, she's worked with Oregon DOT to brand and launch the nation's first mileage-based user fee program called Argo. She's planned and implemented the Keep Oregon Connected program. Next to Jen is Trish Hendren. She's the executive director of the Eastern Transportation Coalition. It's a partnership of 17 states in the District of Columbia that used to be known as the I-95 Corridor Coalition. The coalition has promoted several initiatives aimed at improving safety and efficiency in our transportation network. They've also conducted a pilot program, which I'm happy to say I participated in. Ted Bristol is on the end. He's the Director of Operations for the Mileage-Based User Fee Alliance. He's worked extensively in this issue. He's also coordinated the Alliance's report entitled Bridging the Communications Gap in Understanding Road Usage Charges for the Federal Highway Administration. So if that's not pertinent, I don't know what is. So we're going to ask each of them to come up and start us off with discussion from their point of view. We'll have some follow-up questions, and hopefully at the end we'll have some time for audience questions as well. So I'll ask Jen to come forward. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Can you hear me okay? Great. So looking at this map, you see that MBUF
or road usage charge or VMT or whatever you want to call it. It's, you know, it's a concept that's being tested or implemented throughout the country, and I'm here to talk about the ORIGO program, the Oregon Road Usage Charge Program, which started in 2015. We're one of 3 active programs in the country right now, which means we're collecting money. But Oregon's journey to getting to ORIGO started back in 2001. So they've been looking at this concept for over 20 years. And what they learned from that early research and those early pilots was that RUC is really the most equitable, sustainable, and fair system for collecting revenue as compared to the gas tax. How it works in Oregon is that participants sign up. It's a voluntary program, so it's not mandated. They sign up with an account manager, they choose a mileage reporting option, and then they get a bill for reported miles, and they pay 1.9 cents per mile that they drive on Oregon roads, and then that goes into the state highway fund for construction, maintenance, and preservation of roads and bridges in Oregon. So the program, like ORIGO, that's voluntary, you're not getting like a line of people out the door to sign up initially. I mean, maybe you get, you know, someone like Mark, people in our industry. People really need that incentive to participate. And in 2017, the Oregon legislature was realizing the loss of revenue from gas taxes and decided they were going to put a surcharge on registration for high MPG vehicles as well as electric vehicles. But if you enrolled in ORIGO, you were exempt from those surcharges. So that was really starting to see the incentive, starting to incentivize folks to sign up there. And then most recently, that same road usage charge task force that formed in 2001 went back to the drawing board to say, look, we're going to get really serious about thinking about a mandate concept, a legislative concept. So in 2022, the draft legislative concept called for an official program, statewide program going into effect in 2027 for vehicles that were 2028 or newer, among other things. So you can see up here, and there would be an opt-out option that was really starting to put a lot of what we've learned over all these years into action to really get this going. And then one of the other big things is that will obviously be continued public education and outreach throughout this whole process. So I wanted to look at that, because that's where my expertise lies, is in the communications piece about something so complex. And you can see here it's just a high-level timeline of what our major outreach milestones have been for ORIGO, bookended by the launch in 2015, and then the Keep Oregon Connected education campaign in 2019-2020. Throughout our communications for ORIGO, we've really decided to bring Oregonians into the process, because it is them that are affected by something like this, and we want them, whatever we do to resonate with them. So in 2014, we had some brand focus groups. We decided to brand it because, as you all know, there are many different terms for this type of work. I said at the beginning, when I registered today, one of the ladies up there was like, "What are you talking about today?" And I said, "Road usage charging." She's like, "Is that VMT?" I'm like, "Yes." It's all, MBUF, all of these things. But Oregon decided to brand the program so people could call it ORIGO, and we wouldn't have to go into all of that. So we brought them in 2014 to brand it, and then after a 2016 statewide survey showed us that people still were really confused about transportation funding. Most of them didn't know how they paid for, contributed to the gas tax or anything like that. We decided we needed to craft an education campaign so they could understand the why for ORIGO, and we brought them back to do 60 Oregonians from around the state to do an online qualitative panel. And so they were doing activities on their own time to evaluate messages. And just like in those focus groups, what we heard was there's this visceral connection between how people think about the value of roads and the destinations that they take them around their state. Another value of that online qualitative panel was we were able to track over those months that we were testing messages and visuals, how people's knowledge and attitudes toward the transportation funding situation changed. And you can see here in this graph that, at the beginning, there were fewer people who thought there was adequate funding for transportation or that there was a transportation problem. And at the end, it was the majority of the group that understood what the issues were. So when we created the Keep Oregon Connected campaign, we really anchored it in this these beautiful visuals of landscapes that people told us that really connected their ideas of the value of roads. But then we also layered on top of those visuals messages about facts and figures about the gas tax, about road usage charging, about Origo as a solution. And so it was this combination of emotion and also backfilling with facts so people could get, catch their attention with things that they love and then educate them about the program. We launched in summer of 2020 with earned media. We really tried to reach people everywhere we could to get this in front of them. Digital media, lots of different videos, infographics, things like that. But of course, in February, I think our last in-person event was at the Portland Auto Show in, I think it was early February, late January 2020, and then the pandemic hit, so we took some of the education online, but it was robust to a point and then kind of dropped off. But we did go back and do another statewide survey to compare. Did we move the needle at all from 2016? And what was interesting is we did see that the percentage of people who thought road usage charging was unfair decreased. And so to me, this is a success from a communication standpoint, because what we're really trying to do with a complex topic like this is move people to the middle. We want them to understand and accept these types of solutions, but we're not necessarily looking for everybody to be outright cheerleaders for it. So just to summarize, my lessons learned to date from working on communications for Origo is that emotional calls to action that really tie to the values of how people value roads and how they want to feel connected to them is important. But of course, you always have to have those facts. A lot of data-driven research that's out there that answers their questions once they're like, okay, I get it, now tell me how you're going to do it. But most importantly is we have to continuously talk about this with people, because in that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this is not the top of mind for most people. And so while they care about it, when you talk to them about it, they're not going to seek out that information. So we have to keep putting it in front of them over time. Thank you.
Thank you.
So if you guys might be able to tell up there, but there's like this teeny bit of room between the edge of the stage. That's why we're all like walking up here really carefully. So hopefully we'll see who launches first. I'm hoping it's not going to be me. All right, let me do this, pulling up the presentation. See if I can get my mouse to work. This is a touch screen. No. All right, we're going to escape. All right, that is not working. Can someone sing a song while I try to figure this out? Thank you. There we go. Da 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 da.
Oh,
Is that Jeopardy? Yeah, I'm having a look here.
Here he comes. Here he comes.
Help!
Anybody know Take Me Home Country Roads?
Well, while pulling this up, I guess I'll just first say thank you to Mark and Charlie for inviting me to come to the summit today. And I feel like the topic of today is communicating about mileage-based usage fee, but I feel like this session really should be called talking about transportation, because I think, as Jen touched on, what this lessons we've learned from trying to explore a distance-based fee is what we really need to get better at is talking about transportation. So hopefully that's why you guys are all here, is we need to get better at talking about transportation. Is that one mine? Yeah. It is. Okay, how did you do that?
Magic.
You're magic. All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave.
All right, thank you. Now, Ted comes up and does it smoothly, then we know it's definitely a me problem. Anyway, so why should we pay attention? I think Jen touched on this by looking at kind of those images, connecting where people want to go in Oregon. I mean, all of us got here by transportation. I actually walked on a sidewalk here from the hotel. It was quite lovely. The fact that we have people here, staff working as they got here from transportation. But as Jen highlighted, a lot of people don't think about transportation because we're very fortunate in this country that we have a pretty good system. It works pretty well. So how do we get people to think about something that's kind of invisible? And that is really just a key thing we need to focus on when we're communicating about this potential change and how we fund transportation. And the other kind of issue that we're facing is that that system that we rely on, a lot of people don't pay attention to or realize is really funded by the fuel tax. And we've been hearing about EVs coming for a long time. I think it's fair to say that they are here. We have an administration right now that is very focused on it, as well as this announcement, which to me was kind of a wake-up call, when we have one of the most popular trucks that are sold in our country coming out as electric, it's not just those city dwellers with their teeny cars. So that is going to be a challenge for us as far as how we're going to pay for transportation. But the dirty secret is it's not these guys' fault. So it really is the improved efficiency of all of our vehicles. So this is not an EV problem. This is really an overall fleet change problem. So I'll give you an example. In Virginia, they did an analysis looking out to 2040 and really asked the question, how is our funding going to change? And so that kind of bigger red area there that has 234 on that, 234 million, they're saying that's going to be the loss in fuel tax revenue because of just improved efficiency. So it's about 30% of their loss is from fuel efficiency. Our cars are going farther on a tank of gas, which is great for our wallets, especially given how expensive gas is right now. But it's not so good for the system that we need that money, that fuel tax for. And that teeny tiny little red dots there, that's from the EVs. So as we have this conversation with the public, I think pitting this as an EV problem, I think is not going to do us a service. So that's key as we're communicating about this change. Also, kind of why should North Carolina care about this? Well, a big reason is that we have just a lot more voluntary programs. And just the past few years, we went from 1 to 3. So in this field, that kind of change, that's a pretty notable change, to have 3 states that now have voluntary MBUF programs. So momentum is building. But the question really is, for North Carolina, does it make sense for your state? What do your citizens, what does your industry, what do your users really feel about it? So that's the work the coalition has done in partnership with North Carolina, is to ask the question, would this work for this state? So what we've done, really quickly, who in the world is the coalition? As Mark said, we're this group of 17 states plus DC. We've been around for about 27 years. Our focus is on operations. It's making our systems work as efficiently as possible, getting people and goods across this really important economic engine of our country. So why in the world are we talking about funding? Well, if you don't have money, you don't have operations, you don't have roads. So that's why we got engaged. And there's a national discussion about how we fund transportation. We're different on the East Coast. We've got a lot of out-of-state travel, cross-state travel. We have a lot of toll facilities, huge truck corridor, and we care about what people think. I'm not saying other parts of the country don't, but we got some pretty opinionated people and diversity on our side of the country. So how do we engage? So we wanted to make sure that these 4 areas that we felt was really unique to the East Coast were part of that national discussion. So we went after grants, and we have had 5 grants that we've been awarded. North Carolina came in phase 3. So it's little blue things at the top says phase 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5. So North Carolina came in, as Mark mentioned, we've done 2 pilots in your state. The first pilot was really with some key stakeholders, invitation only, to really start the conversation. And that's been very effective in some other states. So the states in the eastern side of the country that are engaged right now are Delaware, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, New Jersey, Virginia, Georgia, Maine, and Maryland. So that's 8 states. So if we had talked 5 years ago, it would have been 0 states on the East Coast. Again, what does that mean for your state? That's why we're doing these pilots, is to ask your stakeholders, your residents about reactions to this idea, and how do we communicate with them about it. So again, that first stakeholder pilot, what happened in middle of 2020 into 2021, and we just wrapped up a general public pilot. And we're going through the numbers right now on that, and I'm going to take a pause and see if anyone else is willing to share that they participated in the pilot. Mark has done it. I've done it. Excellent. All right. So as we get to the discussion, I would love to hear your reactions to your experience, what you liked and what you didn't like, because that's what this is about, hearing from people that are engaged in this potential way of funding transportation. We've learned a lot about that communication, and I just want to highlight this work we did in Virginia. I feel like I'm picking on Virginia a little bit today. Don't tell them. But this was very effective to get the word out about their new program that launched last summer. So we did digital marketing, which is terrifying to me, how much of our activity on the internet is tracked and how you can pinpoint people based on their activity. So we're like, let's do it. Let's do it for transportation. So we actually targeted people that were eligible for this program, and we fed them different messages to see how they responded. So the good news for us, for the transportation field, is all these messages resonated. So that tells us we have a lot of different ways to talk to people about this way of funding transportation. We can talk about it's innovative. It's a new way to save you money, potentially. Do you care about running over a pothole in your new car? Well, we need some money to make sure that we have those roads are in good condition. And also making sure that we tie this to current concerns about climate change. So all those messages resonated. So that tells us we have a lot of options. So kind of getting to what we've learned, again, getting more states engaged, 0 to 8 states is a pretty notable change. So again, the momentum is really building about this. You guys are in this room because this is likely coming. So what in the world does that mean? How do we make sure North Carolina is ready, and that if it does come to your state or when it comes to your state, it's designed in a way that works for you? The pilots have been key to raising that awareness. We've made sure that the motor carrier industry is at the table. So we've done a multi-state truck pilot, we've done a national pilot, and we just finished an international truck pilot. They are key users and payers of our system, and they're not big cars, right? So we gotta make sure if we go forward with this that we have their concerns and their unique industry in mind. We always wanna keep engaging stakeholders. I'm a data geek, so more we can bring data into this to really counter some of the misperceptions out there is important. And the pilots are key because they highlight what the issues are. So we'll take privacy, a big concern. And the pilots help you figure out how to address that concern by asking people, why are you worried about privacy? And so we've learned that if you have choices, it's really key. If you have very transparent data use agreements, what are you gonna do with my data? Are you gonna sell it? Are you gonna destroy it? Who are you gonna give it to? You gonna give it to a cop? So we gotta be very clear about data, and we've learned that from the pilot. All right, so my last 2 slides, kind of where does that leave us? Again, that momentum is building. We have more voluntary programs. There's more draft legislation being brought forth in several states. There's more pilots happening. So again, for North Carolina, you wanna make sure you're at the table, which I applaud the North Carolina Department of Transportation. I'm gonna highlight Amna, who's in the room, to really her leadership and the Secretary's leadership in doing this. It's a tough topic, but if we don't take advantage, quite frankly, of these grants and figure out what's good for North Carolina, then others will figure it out for us, and we don't want that. So we're kind of teetering on the edge here, so what do we need to do? More pilots. Next time if I am invited back, I hope I ask the question, have you been involved in a pilot? And the whole room raises your hand. Because I really got to experience this firsthand. It really makes a difference. We got to do better at messaging, and then eventually we'll need legislation. All right, I look forward to the discussion. Thank you. And for the record, I just pulled up Ted's presentation.
You're welcome, Ted. Everybody, I mean, I know, it's so nice to be.
Pulled up my presentation and you navigated the podium
I know.
without falling.
It's like win-win.
So I have a really high bar to
I know,
clear here.
exactly.
All right. But what you didn't do is, then how do I
didn't do that. That's true.
which is the thing that I hit to put it up on the screen?
Oh, God, I don't want to get up again, but I can show you.
Is it that? Do you remember?
Yep.
Trish, what was the thing that you put it up on the screen?
I
with?
didn't do that.
Oh, he didn't. He did it for you. Right.
It's the magician in the back.
I suck.
We've only been together for about
I
a half
lost
an
it.
hour.
It was-
We're already a fully functioning.
know where
I
it went.
know.
It's that guy.
I did so well and got the presentation.
We
out,
lost the
but-
cursor.
We lost the cursor, that's what the problem was. Oh, there it is, I found
All right,
it.
where's the Jeopardy song? Where's
Yeah,
the
thank
one
you.
again? There we go. Da-da-da. Are we gonna? Ted's gonna be faster than me. That's the embarrassing part. All right.
All righty. Thank you. Thank you, Trish. That was a terrific presentation, as always. And Jen, I was thinking, I'd never really thought of transportation or road usage charges as in the hierarchy of needs. And so I've been thinking about that since you presented. But I actually think it is appropriate because, in a way, driving almost is, in the United States, high on the hierarchy of needs. And what we're trying to figure out is how to enable everybody to continue driving on high-quality roads. So I'm going to start, I want to introduce the Miles-Based User Fee Alliance. So we are DC-based. We were formed in 2010, and the reason for the formation of the organization was really because states like Oregon were starting to really look at mileage-based fees. There really wasn't a coordinated message going forth. There's almost probably a little bit of competition between states. I'm sure that doesn't happen anymore. No. But and we wanted to bring in a unified voice into Washington, particularly. And so we include state transportation as members. We include technology vendors, businesses, academics, transportation policy experts, all part of our team. and we have over just about 50 members, more than a dozen state DOTs. North Carolina is among them. We work closely with Trish and her members. Oregon has been a founding member. We have the common mission of trying to advance mileage-based fees in Washington. So, and this slide is really simple. Just we basically what we've been doing over the years is we've been working closely with Congress, not as a lobbying organization, but as an educational organization, and bringing to Congress sort of the collective thoughts on trying to create a stage and an awareness for mileage-based fees. And so this is, you know, we're at a place now where it's sort of commonly accepted, but when we started, this was a pretty radioactive concept. The idea that there was a lot of anxiety, particularly among more conservative members, around issues that, you know, Trish just described: privacy, fairness, urban versus rural, all of those issues that can really make a pretty hot political argument. And also at that time, the idea of hybrids, electric vehicles, the crisis in terms of revenue being raised was almost a little bit theoretical. It's the idea that we're going to have, you know, that the pace of change in the fleet, I think, continues to amaze everyone. And it just seems to, every time you look at a study, it's going faster and faster. I just want to share this because what I wanted to do here, and the piece I want to bring in, is to sort of bring the federal lens to this policy, to this discussion. So Trish did a fantastic job talking about the state perspective, but the federal perspective. Why is the federal government looking at this? It's similar to yours, but as we all know here, I think the federal government and surface transportation infrastructure is paid for through the Highway Trust Fund. Highway Trust Fund is largely supported by excise tax on gasoline. This graph shows the blue line is the available revenue through the trust fund. The orange line shows expenditures and projected expenditures, and those dotted lines show general revenue transfers. So you can see that there's been a steady shortfall, which Congress has had to bail out 6 times since 2005 in order to keep it going. And during that period, I've used the electric vehicle example, Trish, but your point is well taken. But it's just so handy to show that the growth is tremendous. And so here from Bloomberg, in 2021, electric vehicles are less than 5% of vehicle sales. They're now projecting them to be maybe half car sales in 2030. That's only 7 years away from now. And I think you read internationally, globally, the pace is going even faster. So just if you look at through the lens of electric vehicles, the issue is real. So I'm just going to go through the history a little bit here. So, because we're all policymakers, I think we understand the challenges of working in government and for government to get ahead of a problem. So in 2005, when they first saw that we're having this shortfall, Congress did what a lot of legislative bodies do, and I think it's the right thing to do. They created a commission to study the problem and make recommendations. And so they created the National Surface Transportation Infrastructure Financing Commission, 2005. It made the recommendation that the long-term sustainable solution is mileage-based fees. And they released that report in 2007. And they also said not only did they recommend mileage-based fees, they recommended that they be put in place by 2020, 3 years ago, which was probably too ambitious. But I think it just shows that we've been working to try to get on top of this problem for now almost 20 years. Since then, so in 2015, Congress, through the FAST Act, put in place the pilot grants. $95 million over 5 years available to states to test out and test various concepts related to mileage-based fees, with the idea that this program would then guide the federal government as to, is this a viable solution? Is this a viable alternative to the gas tax? And can it be done? Does the technology work? Can we answer all the myriad of questions related to fairness, equitability, urban versus rural? It was tremendously successful. And I remember meeting actually with, because I'm pointing at Trish because Delaware, the state of Delaware, Senator Carper is the committee chair and of the Environment and Public Works Committee in the Senate. Extremely supportive of this. And the staff people then at the time said, we really want results in 5 years so that we can decide what to do, because Congress authorizes transportation programs every 5 years. So we want to be ready for the next 5-year bill to be able to see whether we go forward with this. They also don't pass their authorization bills on a 5-year schedule, which those of you who work in government understand that sometimes it takes a little longer to get on schedule. However, in the Infrastructure Act in 2021, which was that massive bill that was passed in 2021, it continued the state pilot grants, and it also authorized a $50 million national pilot, which we'll talk about more here. The significance of this is that there is a sense of urgency from Congress to gather the information that's coming from states in order to determine whether or not this is a viable system nationally, not at the state level, but nationally. And so they're looking for the states to draw from the states significant reports. There was a GAO report last winter that looked at what had been going on and pushing the Federal Highway Administration, Department of Transportation, to gather up and help determine whether this is scalable, whether this is something to go at the national level. And so just to conclude here, the point I'm really making is I think we're going to see from federal policymakers a real sense of urgency, aggressive oversight. Is this going to be the alternative for when we need to reauthorize the bill in 2026? When are we getting there, or is this really conceptually a great idea, but it's not something that's really we can implement at the federal level? So, thank you. Of course, I don't know how to get rid of that. Okay.
So I want to thank.
It's already on. It's already on. He mutes it.
Good. I usually don't use a mic. My voice tends to carry, but want to thank Jen and Trish and Ted for those excellent presentations. I had some preliminary questions written down, and I've kind of been taking notes, so I'm not going to use them. But what I will ask Jen first, we think of Oregon as the prototype, probably the paragon of these sorts of pilot programs. We consider you to have been highly successful. So my question to you is, are you happy with the way it's gone since the inception, or at least satisfied? And what would you do differently if you could go back and change some things along the way?
Well, I've only been involved since about 2014, and strictly from the perspective of communicating about this program. And I think my perspective has evolved as we've learned more from Oregonians and from the public about how they think about this. But I'm happy in a sense that we've had so many touch points over the years, and that, a lot of times when you think about your state DOTs, a problem will happen and people will say, well, why didn't you plan for that? Why weren't you thinking about this ahead of time and doing something? And I think with Orgo and a lot of state road usage charge programs and buff programs, they're not going to be able to say that because we've been looking at this for so long. We've been trying to plan for this process for so long. So in that way, I'm feeling very happy about it. But I do think, and I think Virginia has been really successful with their voluntary program, but I do think you just have to invest more time. Legislators will always say, well, what does the public think? How can we get more public acceptance for this? And the only way to do that is to be out there talking to them about it more, to make them make this a part of their lives, to see the urgency behind it. And you have to pass policies to do that. You have to keep it at the forefront for people to care about it. And so I think in a way, there's only so much control as a program that the DOT had over doing that, right? Like you need your policymakers to be making moves. And I think I'm looking forward to this next this legislative session and the next one to see if we do get this legislative concept through, and then from there it'll get really exciting. So I'm really excited about the future.
So a moment of personal privilege before I ask Trish the question. I did participate in her first pilot program, and I live in a mostly rural county in the eastern part of the state, and my primary vehicle is an F-150 pickup truck. So I was very interested to understand from my personal perspective what a mileage-based user fee would look like for me, because I know I buy a lot of gas and my vehicle isn't particularly fuel efficient. But my experience was, based on about a year of data collection, that I would pay slightly less if I paid by the mile under a mileage-based user fee than I pay in gas tax at the pump, even though I drive a lot of miles in a low fuel efficiency car. So my question then, based on my personal experience for Trish, is how have you solved some of the questions that have come up about the urban versus rural divide, and how do you message that?
We'll pass the mic. So, Mark, I'm glad that you shared your experience. Of the folks who also participated, who raised their hand, did anybody else from a more rural area? Was that your experience too, that you paid less than you thought?
I was like you, because I drive 75 miles each way to and from work.
Yep.
And the biggest gas guzzling kid hauler.
Yep.
possible.
Yep.
I was really surprised.
And
Yeah, and like Mark.
so you paid less than you thought, it sounds like. Yeah. So I think kind of jumping on the question you asked Jen, like, do we feel that the work that we're doing in partnership with North Carolina and other states is working? I think yes, because we're getting that real world experience of individuals who enter into this potential future with an idea. I'm not going to like it. It's government tracking me. I'm going to be double taxed. This is going to be horrible, a hassle, and you name all these negative things. And then they do it. They're like, oh, it's not Secretary Boyette tracking where I'm driving. It is actually a private company in technology. Oh, I can actually learn some stuff about my car. So I, too, have a kid hauler. And one morning going to haul the kids around, I get in and turn the ignition of my very old car, and the battery's dead. I sure would have liked to have been in the pilot at that time, because I would have gotten a message that said my battery was low. My day would have been much better. So what people are learning from this new way of funding transportation, why I think it is good, is it may actually be more, it would be better for rural communities than people think. And I say that with caution, because it all depends on how you drive your vehicle. There's always exceptions. But the gut reaction to distance-based fees, it will be unfair to rural communities. So we're doing these pilots and get individuals like yourself and Mark to participate, so people will realize that that's not true. And I'm sure everyone's scratching their head being like, that doesn't make any sense. But right now, a lot of rural drivers are paying more because they're driving longer distances, older vehicles, more fuel inefficient vehicles. So what's happening right now is how we pay for transportation is about the vehicle you drive, not about how many miles you drive. But if we go back to Oregon, being a leader, back in 1919, you guys are show-offs. The gas tax. So when the gas tax was first created, it was supposed to be a usage fee because all the cars were the same. But now that kind of link is broken. So I think that's why it's so important to do this work, is to highlight that the concept of the more you use, the more you pay resonates. So how do we get back to that? We gotta get back to actually the using part, which is miles, not what kind of vehicle you have. So I think that's been really important finding and a conversation piece to have from the work.
Can I say one thing on that too? Just another thing that we found resonates with rural communities when we're talking about Oregon and other places is this concept of resiliency. Out in Oregon, we've had some pretty devastating wildfires the past couple of summers that have closed highways that are these major connectivity points for a lot of people that live in more rural communities. So when you think about roads and you think about their value in your life, there's never a more important time than when you can't use them to get somewhere. And so when you think about long-term investment, that's how we can bring people into these discussions, and especially connecting how their road usage payment would go, how that would feed into the state funding. So I think we're starting to hear more questions about the how, and connecting to those values. So I think that's been useful.
And in eastern North Carolina, our parallel is when the hurricane blows through and our roads and bridges are out for weeks at a time, and we have to drive 50 miles out of the way. So for Ted, it was encouraging that the Infrastructure Act extended the state pilots. So were there any interesting nuggets that you gleaned from some of those other pilots that we haven't touched on that maybe will inform what you hope the federal pilot will look like?
You can use the one on the end.
Yeah, I think that, well, from the, of course, the newly funded ones haven't even gotten started. So really, it's drawing on the projects that are already, the pilots that are already in place. And, the thing that really strikes me actually is this issue that some of the, technologically, it's been proved over and over that it works. Trish and Jen both talked about how the issues of privacy, that the sort of the red button issues, the hot button issues of privacy, choice and data security, a lot of that is answerable, but I think that the problem with that is not so much the technology and the system, it's just this general world we're in where there's a lack of trust in large public institutions, lack of trust in government, even a lack of trust in some companies. Everybody has a story now of personal, either having your credit card hijacked or data insecurity, so there's just a lot of anxiety about that. But the fact of the matter is, really, I believe, and you would all know better than I, that probably for a transportation department, you don't really want to know where one person goes. You really are interested in the aggregate of what's driver behavior. And a lot of that can be protected, but the hard thing is the communication piece, is communicating to people that, yes, you can trust us, and it's harder to get people to trust you when you're starting from behind. So, but I think I think the really difficult question at the national level that really need to draw from states, and I'm probably not as, I think a lot of the states are just kind of moving this direction, is how to really make it work at a federal level collecting money. How do you do this interoperability? How do you get this data from the states? What if states all don't want to do it, how do you make it work in that state? And that part, I think at the federal level is different than the state level, and a lot of what Trish is doing and in the Ruck West group are doing, kind of looking at the state-to-state interoperability. But I think that, to me, those are the questions the pilot has to answer, and so to figure out if it can work. And I think we don't think we're quite there yet as to know whether or not, from what we've seen at the state level, how this would really function if you're putting a national pilot together. It's part of the reason we need to do it. So.
Well, hang on to the mic a second, and I'll try to project, but when we hear excuses from the states about not wanting to undertake this sort of program, they always say, well, there's this interstate operability question. That's why the feds have to do it. So is that a fair argument?
And I really want to look to, I'm looking really hard at Trish and Jen, but here's my view. I don't think we want to dictate how to do it, but I do think that what the federal guidance can be is to be sure that there is the interoperable capability, because the last thing you want is just like kind of a little bit in the easy pass world. You don't want to have to work 5 different systems to operate, especially on the East Coast, between states. You want to be able to just, the beauty of what we have now, right, is you don't even know you're paying a tax, frankly. And so if you create a problem now with you're paying way more attention, and you got to go, I got to do it this way if I drive through Delaware, if I got to do this way in Virginia, another way in North Carolina, that's not going to work. And so that's what I think the federal piece needs to be here.
So yeah, I'll chime in and say we can't wait for the feds. I think the challenges that states are going to have for their own transportation system, if we wait for the feds to come up with a solution, I don't want the feds telling us what to do. So I think Each state needs to explore this, and again, I applaud North Carolina for the leadership in doing this. We will need some national standards, and I say that because I'm a state sovereignty girl. So the state's got to dictate what they want for themselves, but for the cross-state traffic, and especially for the trucking industry, we're going to have some national standards. So there is a huge role for that national pilot, but I'm going to be pretty darn pissed if they don't listen to the lessons that we've learned on the state level. So I want to be convinced that $50 million really should be spent on a national pilot. So I'm not right now. I'd rather have that money go to the states and have us figure it out. We're the laboratories of a democracy, right? Isn't that the byline? So I am cautiously optimistic, but I'm also raring to jump in and be like, no, you don't. So we'll see.
And I will say, yeah, there's a lot of lessons to learn too. Like California, for example, has been doing some smaller pilots, testing things like collecting the mileage at gas stations. So like repurpose, they're trying all different methods to try and improve the ease of collection from the user side, then also the administrative side. So I think there's a lot that can be learned from states that have been doing this for a while.
So this follow-up would be for all of you. We've touched on a couple of misconceptions, or I would call them that. Other people might call them observations. But like interstate interoperability and the urban-rural divide. But what are some other misconceptions about mileage-based user fee programs that you've encountered, maybe even some that are humorous? And what are the best ways to communicate, what are the best messages and communication channels when you're trying to address those sorts of things?
Couple that come to mind for me is just when you're talking about any wholesale change with the public, they're immediately freaking out about it. That's how we process change, and because majority of them haven't been paying attention, as we've been talking over the years, when they think something's going to be then a mandate, all of a sudden they're paying attention, so they're going through all the stages of change at once, which isn't ideal. But what I always want to say to folks is it's going to be a while probably before you have to participate in even if it's a mandated program. Like you were saying, Trish, you have an old car. My car, I have a 2007 Camry that I'll drive till it dies. My husband drives a 2004 Hyundai Santa Fe, and we're like, we own them, we're going to drive them until they die. And that's going to be the case for a lot of people. And so when you look at a program like Oregon's proposing that takes effect in 2027 for 2028 models or newer, you are getting a lot of those early adopters, people who are buying those brand new cars that are having, this is affecting them sooner. For most folks, we're looking at 2035. So this is, even though legislation would pass sooner, it's a while before it's really affecting everybody, and there's going to be a lot of evolution in technology. And then the other thing I'll say is there's also this judgment electric vehicle owners or people who bought hybrids feel about then having to have this thing focus on this type of program focus on them. And what I always say is, well, and I think there's a lot more data about this now, but like how heavy electric vehicles are, like just if you put damage on the roads, we still have to fix it, and we all have to pay for sure. So there's a lot of good data about yes, it's good for the environment, but we still have to fix our roads and bridges.
So I think we've touched on several of the misperceptions, but the one that just makes me so sad is that people don't think there's a problem. So I'll look at a recent, it's 2020 public opinion survey in North Carolina, and you might be excited about this. It was like 71% of the people thought the highways in North Carolina were pretty darn good. So that's like a victory dance for the DOT. But then you follow it up with, so how do you think funding's going? And people think funding is going up or staying the same. So if you combine those two things, people don't think there's a problem. Roads are pretty good. Thank you, the Department of Transportation. And you got plenty of money. And people really think that right now when they go to fill up their cars because gas prices are so high. And we just had this large infrastructure bill. So how in the world are we going to convince the public that we have a problem when they don't really think there's a need for more investment and that we're flush with cash? So I think that we had to face that reality and how we engage with folks. And I think we found some fun ways to do it. It's amazing how much videos like people will watch, like a minute video. So I know Oregon's had a video, some other states have. I think we need more of those out there that are fun, they're easy to watch. And believe it or not, the media was a good partner in our most recent general public pilot in North Carolina. And that's always risky because they can turn a story in a way that might make it more dramatic and I would say not factually true. After working at an agency, it's really hard to see that. But that's how people consume information, is little snippets on their phone, on the internet about, headlines from news articles. So if we're going to engage with the public about this really complicated subject, getting into the media is going to be really key. Getting some of this diverse video technology and video way of consuming information. And then, believe it or not, I'll take something from Hawaii. Send something from the DMV. Everybody opens up a letter from the DMV. If you want to get people to ingest some information, that's a good way to get information out there. So there's a lot of different tactics that I think states, Oregon again being a leader out there, that we can communicate. But I think we have to be really honest with what we're communicating and start with the values, as Jen said. Start with the understanding that people don't think there's a problem. So we kind of got to catch people up a little bit before saying, we're going to start charging you by the mile. They're going to be like, what? Like, what are you doing? So I think we have to be a little bit better as a profession to kind of build our case and hopefully do it in a way that's more fun than this geek can figure out. So that's why we hire people like Jen.
So I don't think well, I'm not going to say that. I may be wrong. Should we be thinking about mileage-based user fees in a vacuum as a long-term sustainable source of funding, or must we always lump in gas tax with it and consider them to be alternatives to one another? Is that fair?
I'll be quick because I don't think this is totally my area of expertise, but just working in this so long, I think it's always got to be a combination of factors, and I think that's what a combination of sources, and I think that's what Oregon's been working through with this draft legislative concept, is that you have to consider all of the ways that you're going to keep your transportation system funded, and that's going to include gas tax from combustion engines for a long time, as well as road usage charge, as well as opt-out fees. It's going to be this combination of things. So that's what I understand.
So I think you're pretty good, given that you're saying you're not an expert. I think that's spot on. So every state has a mix of revenue sources of how they fund their transportation system, and each state is slightly different. But a fuel tax is a key part of almost every state. I mean, the percentage will range. So knowing that source is declining, the idea is this will replace it. So again, I keep saying that because people think we're talking about yet another tax. So it is a phase out. So it wouldn't be Jen and I's old cars that would be required to participate in a distance-based fee. It would be new vehicle owners and vehicles that have high efficiency. So it would be a transition, which is messy. So I think the other aspect of your question, Mark, though, is just switching over to the motor carrier industry for a minute. So with them, they have a lot of fees, a lot of regulations, and they actually are now paying for their use of roads by the mile by the state. So they have a national system where they will fill up in one state, they'll drive through 10 other, and that fuel tax is allocated across those states. So you think, oh, they're ready. Let's just put a distance-based fee on the trucking industry. I think that would be very not advised, because it would go yet another burden. It's kind of, why are we doing that? So I think that's why the coalition, we've been very careful to have the motor carrier industry at the table to say, okay, they recognize the need for more money. Unlike the general public, right? They get it. This is their office. They're out on those roads every day. They want investment in their roads where they are working. But how we go forward, the trucking industry, I think we have to be very careful. It can't just be another thing. So I think they're open to the discussion, which I think is a change in a stance than they have been in several years ago, where they just slammed the door in my face and said, go away. So change is coming. How we deal with that change in the motor carrier industry has got to be within their current very heavily regulated fee-intensive reality. On the public sector side, or so on the passenger vehicle side, that's going to be kind of this transition, getting them used to it, and kind of slow transition.
Quick, before you hand it off to Ted, just a follow-up on that. Is the fact that the trucking fleet is electrifying part of their change of thought?
yes, but I think that there's a little bit of more hype than there is reality on the electrification of the trucking industry. I think we have to look at other sources. So I'm going to geek out here for a second or go down a tangent. So I think hydrogen might be a longer term solution for the motor carrier industry, just given the weight of the batteries and the charging time requirement. So for the trucking industry, again, they want investment in their roads that they're using. But their fleet is changing. They're not, the current problem is the EVs on the trucking side. And their fleet does not as improved efficiency as much as the passenger side. So again, we got to really concentrate on what's the problem we're trying to solve. It is not a decline in revenue from the trucking industry. But we have to recognize, yes, their fleet's changing. Yes, they want to have more investment. So how do we kind of bring that need into their world in a way that they'll accept and won't overburden them and will just hurt our economy? Hopefully I made some sense there.
You did to me.
Okay, there we go. Thank you, Ted.
And I think what you said about the transition being messy is incredibly important because and you work on the messaging in this, Jen, but this issue of double taxation, it just is, I think we're so vulnerable to that, and we can just see it from what happened this past year with the spike in gas taxes, and what was the government response was to have a suspension of gas tax collections. It is, I think, I'm sure it's actually, in Washington, D.C., raising the gas tax is considered the political third rail. It hasn't been done in 30 years, whereas states have faced it down and done that. But I think anything that is perceived as, I think there's an assumption that government's going to tax you twice. It's just looking for another way to get into your pocket. And I think that anything, getting through this transition period is just going to be incredibly difficult because, as you said, it's not going to happen smoothly. I think, to me, it's why maybe again, watching electric vehicles, in a way, it's almost, you almost could see how that could happen much more smoothly than working where we are, because there's no fee on an electric vehicle right now. So you put, whatever the states have decided to do, a fee at registration, it's there. You're sort of creating a new framework for assessing those vehicles, which is a lot easier, I think, than transitioning. So.
So we've spent a lot of time up here talking to you, but what I want to do now in the 10 or 15 minutes we have left is to give the audience an opportunity to ask questions, because I think this has been so thought-provoking that you're bound to have some. So I want to give you all the chance to do that. And Andrew has a microphone, and he'll come to you, so just stand up where you are, and
Thanks,
he'll
Mark.
get you.
I'll let you kind of point out the speaker or the audience. And when I come to you, I'll just hold the microphone for you. You don't have to grab it from me.
The gentleman right there on this aisle with his hand up was the first one I saw. And then we'll come over here to Representative Shepard, and we'll come back over here.
You going to turn it on, Dave? Great. I'll just hold it for you.
Thank you. Last year at this event, my recollection is that we had in one session two legislators who were Democrats and one who was a Republican. You could have cut the air in the room or on the stage with a knife. There was a lot of political interplay between mileage-based fees and, for example, additional taxes on either new vehicles or TBA, tires, batteries, and accessories. In the pilot programs, has there been any type of tax that is not mileage-based that is considered being integrated into the school?
So I can say for the grant work, the short answer is no. But I'm going to give a slightly longer answer. There are some states that are looking at charging the charger. So charging the station where EVs are plugging in to get charged. And we were thinking about looking at that with Vermont, because Vermont's concern was it's a beautiful state to go visit, not that North Carolina's not. And what they wanted to do is out-of-towners coming to Vermont, the legislators wanted to charge those out-of-towners for using charging stations because they weren't contributing anything to the roads they're using in Vermont. So they did the analysis, and we were going to use some of these grant funds to do some work in Vermont, but they ran the numbers, and I'll say the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. So I bring that up because some states, so Oklahoma recently passed legislation to charge the charger, And we're all kind of looking at that legislation to be like, okay, is that what we want to do? Because I will say my personal opinion, I'm not representing my board right now. I think that is a little bit unadvised because it continues to have that link between how you pay for transportation is based on your vehicle versus what we're trying to do is get back to the philosophy of the way you pay for transportation is how much you use it. So a little bit long-winded response to your question, but I will just end by saying the beauty of transportation, Democrats, Republicans all believe and we need it. Where you get that cutting the air with a knife is when how you pay for it. So, but I think I'm seeing at least more openness. I think having a state like Georgia, more red state, being engaged in this discussion is going to be key. I'm going down to Tennessee in 2 weeks to talk to their legislature. Kentucky is looking at this. So I think we need to not have this be a Democrat-Republican issue. And so as much as a group like mine that is nonpartisan, that we can try to make sure we're talking to everybody, I think is going to be key because we gotta move past the party if we can.
Yeah, I know Ohio is doing a active pilot right now. And I'll say just Oregon, I think a lot of states, and I'm seeing this in the West, is imposing these flat fee at registrations for EVs. And they're usually pretty, depending on what you can afford, but like, I think that the idea is, would you rather pay $450 at registration, or would you rather do this thing where you're paying per mile that you drive over time? So I think that there's an equity component there that we're looking at as well with flat fees and what that could do to folks and how they'd rather pay for things. So there's that give and take.
So this was not a setup, but our next question is coming from State Representative Phil Shepard from Onslow County.
Let me go ahead and say I wasn't here in that meeting last year that you could cut the knife.
It wasn't you.
I don't think he needs
Make
this.
that real clear. My question is, how many states have fully implemented mileage-based tax and done away with gas tax per se? I have no comparability.
0. There's 3 active programs, including Oregon, who I'm representing today, which means we are collecting money. They're all voluntary programs, and I think I know Oregon and Washington are both looking at legislation in this legislative session or next to make a mandate that would make it official. They'd still be collecting gas tax from all those vehicles that still use gas, but that they would be collecting road usage charge fees from vehicles that are 2028 models or later.
Gentleman over here in the blue shirt,
Gotcha.
and then back to the middle.
I'll just hold this for you.
That's fine. So a curiosity question for the North Carolina pilot. Of course, the people in this room, most of them know that North Carolina maintains more road miles than everybody else but Texas, and sometimes ahead of Texas, depending on how it's being counted, right? So for the North Carolina pilot, how did you make that that value that you use to compare to the gas tax for the people here? I mean, how does that play into, or are you looking at what North Carolina's budget is or shortfall is for the need compared to other states? Obviously, our gas tax is higher than Virginia's because we maintain so many more miles. So just how did you come up with what you did there?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the question. It's really important because I think there has not been enough discussion about how a per mile rate would be set. So right now what's happening around the country is it is revenue neutral. So what that means is based on the North Carolina state fuel tax, based on your average MPG, based on your average miles traveled, that's how we come up with the per mile rate. So what that means, this goes back to that rural-urban question. So if you are driving a vehicle that is less fuel efficient, you will pay less under a distance-based fee so it's some fun math in there, which I will probably give myself a headache if I try to do it right now and embarrass myself, so I won't. But the point is, how do we want to set that rate? And I think that is a really key question for states to start asking, which is a really scary question. Because all the complications we've been talking about, now we have to say, okay, what are you going to base that rate on? Is it based on North Carolina's transportation revenue needs? What the gap between what you have and what you need? Like, that's going to be scary. Is it based on something else? And then we all know, wink, wink, we're going to have to raise it. Well, that's going to be hard for your political environment. So I really appreciate the question, but the answer right now is we're at the stage in this conversation trying to get people to understand what the heck it is we're talking about. So revenue neutral, to take that rate setting question off the table, but we got to get it back on there at some point.
Gentleman right here in the center, Andrew. Was somebody right here? Yes.
So, given the collections, how is that working in Oregon, given that it's a voluntary program, and what's the admin cost? So, if you set it at 1.9% or 1.9 cents per mile, you know, gas tax is collected as point of sale, so fewer hands are touching it, which means more of it's going straight to the coffers. So, what's the admin and under collection, and what's that cost?
I'm not sure because I'm a communications person. I can tell you that collecting a mileage-based user fee is exponentially more expensive than collecting the gas tax, and I think that's on a lot of people's minds and what is being explored in a lot of pilots recently. I know a lot of the West Coast states are looking at that, and so that's really going to be the bigger challenge: is how do you offset those collection costs with what you can reinvest? And I think that's going to be something that we're going to be continuing to explore. How can we minimize that? I don't know exactly how much of what's collected goes to the fund versus to administrative costs. And Oregon hasn't kept up a regular, like a big enough group of volunteer participants to really have like a great representation of what it would be like in the state. But I think that's the thing, right? Incentivizing people to participate. And so they moved to that point about low mileage vehicles. In the beginning of Oregon, they let people with all types of vehicles participate, but they were giving out a lot of gas tax rebates to people who had cars that got below 20 mpg. And so now the program is really focused more on those high mpg and electric vehicle programs, because that's where those people aren't paying into the gas tax already. So
Pass it to Ted. Let's get a couple of final thoughts from Ted, and then we'll wrap up and let you guys go to lunch.
Just not on this question, though, right?
Anything you want to talk about?
Because
Freeform.
All right. Here's what I'd want to just kind of circle back to something that Trish said, because this I do think is important, and I'm going to sound like I'm the DC guy, which I sort of am, right? But I do think that we need to be. I think that the concept here of states piloting and developing it and breaking trail is exactly right, and is exactly the intent behind what's the state grant program. The really tricky part is where you were getting concerned about a national pilot, because I think we need to expect that the federal government's the Congress is only going to fund state pilots for a finite period of time if it doesn't look like it's producing an answer to the federal problem. And so that, I think, is the tricky tension. I think that's what I really think in the next few years is just going to be at one level really, really important to pay attention to. And part of, and I think it was who said the question, but you were talking about it, and I'm sure you've both had to do this. The other piece of the national pilot that I think is going to be really helpful, and really it'll be the key sign that we're finally moving on it, is there's a requirement in the legislation to create an advisory panel. And it will include, and it's to include a whole range of stakeholders. I would not be surprised if we know people who would be part of that, and they should be, and it would include states as well. I think that will really help to provide some comfort to the fear that the federal government just sort of going to wade into this in a really clumsy way and spoil all the good work that's been done, and rather than try to draw on what's already been set up to date. And so I think those are kind of the two pieces that I wanted to share, that I just, especially because we have a new chair in the Congress. There's a new chairman of the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee, strong supporter of mileage fees, but also really impatient to get it. And I think you can understand that. I think this is just me. I think politicians, I think the chairman would love to be part of the solution to this funding problem as part of his legacy. I think Mr. DeFazio before him wanted to be there. I think Senator Carper wants to be there. So I think there's going to be an energy to try to create the solution to this problem. So that would be my my closing comments.
So I think I'm going to jump on the admin costs just for a minute, and then I'll add another comment as well. So I think what Jen said is right, that it's going to be more expensive if we compare today's fuel tax versus a distance-based fee. But I think that's a little bit unfair because we've had the fuel tax since 1919. And in the beginning, the fuel tax was pretty expensive to collect, a lot of paper. I mean, I don't want to make fun of 1919, but you get the point. So I think they're not efficient, but there's an opportunity, I think, to use technology to make some of those efficiencies. One reason why the coalition work, we really want to collaborate with the tolling industry is they have a lot of experience trying to lower their admin costs. So how can we learn from them? There's some national systems in place that can kind of process fuel tax. So I don't want the admin costs to be the barrier that makes the conversation stop. We need to have the conversation, but I think there's a way, as this scales, that costs will come down. And I am a believer in technology and the private sector to come up with some clever solutions as well. So I think right now it's pretty dismal numbers, but I think it's going to go down. Okay, so then my final thought, I'm going to go back to the stakeholder comment. I'm hoping that everybody in this room considers yourselves a stakeholder now in this discussion. Talk to your neighbors about transportation, which hopefully you do because I know you're geeks because you're here. But also talk about like how we fund transportation. Talk about how they would react to having a device in their car, and they're going to freak out, right? But I think if each one of us can have a couple conversations, I think that will help. So that is, I think, my final ask and request. And the next, I should say again, or another one, the next time there's a pilot, in North Carolina, please volunteer. If you hear about it, so next time, if I'm lucky enough to come and visit you all again, I want everyone's hand to raise as far as that they've experienced it firsthand. So that's my request.
I mean, that's pretty much what I was going to say too. But I will say too that we really pilots are an exciting opportunity to bring in a representative sample of people from around the state too, to really like go out into communities and find people who don't think about this kind of stuff and bring them in, whether it's an actual pilot or it's the chance to do an online panel or a focus group or something like that, because all of those touch points is helping us educate people, because then they're going to go back and talk to people around the dinner table and at the water cooler and all the other places that people talk to the people that they trust, and they're going to have discussions about it. And then if you bring them into creating campaigns too, they feel ownership over that. They see the messaging that they worked on. They see those visuals that they worked on. We saw that with Keep Oregon Connected. So, and that's really a model that can work anywhere. People love to feel like they've contributed to something.
So real quick before we go, Tony Lathrop caught my eye. Did you have something real quick to add?
Real quick, collection and efficiency. What's the status of the technology to collect at a charging station?
As far as charging of the...
Right, like if I stop
Yep.
along the highway and charge my vehicle, is there a way to collect a mileage-based fee or a fee based on energy use there that is feasible?
But the short answer is the technology is not fully there yet. And it's because you need to, let's think of, you guys have Wawas here, right? No? Yeah? Kind of, okay. Sheets, okay. So if they're a charging station at Sheets, is it Sheets that's supposed to collect the charge on the charge and then give it to the DOT, but then they want some of it because it's their property? And that's an example of on a private site. If it's at a rest area, that's a public site. So being able to distinguish who is charging, is it a local resident or an out-of-towner, being able to have the technology that can then record it and give the players involved the right allocation of that funds. That's why I'm saying we're not there yet. And again, looking at Oklahoma and their recent legislation to start charging the charger, I think will be really informative for the rest of the country. So a lot of eyes on them because so far we've not had success. The short answer.
So in the interest of keeping us on schedule, I'd like to recognize again Jen Rash, Trish Hendren, Ken Bristol, Ted, Ken, Ted. In any case, our excellent panel, please give them a round of applause. And thanks for coming.